Class, today I picked behavior and social learning theory. My name is Mr. Mata. I wanted to go through why I picked Ivan Pavlov's behavior and social learning theory. Basically, it's something that's always interested me because I always want to know why certain students in certain situations act a certain way. Is there certain mechanisms that bring out that behavior? So we're going to go look at that today. But before we start, I wanted to test out and try something really interesting. What are your thoughts on social behavior? What do you guys really feel that if students are affected by certain mechanisms, let's say for example, when we have attention getters, have you noticed that when students hear something, for example, in my classroom, I say, class, class, and everyone goes, yes, yes. After a while, they get used to it, and it becomes a habitual norm. So, just wanted to quickly talk about that and see what your thoughts were. But anyways, let me introduce you into Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian scientist who wanted to study the digestion patterns of mammals. He wanted to see why they were salivating. So he decided that he was going to find out why this was happening. As I change myself. So he wanted to see exactly what it had to do specifically into dogs, because mammals end up salivating. So he says, you know what, I think the same thing's going to happen for dogs. But oddly enough, when he did the study, he found out, hey, you know what, something's going on because dogs aren't doing the same thing. So he had to look at different factors. He had to find a new way to study it. So when he was doing his study, he noticed that the scientists who kept feeding the dogs were wearing lab coats. And that's strange enough. You say, well, what do lab coats have to do? A lot of people wear lab coats, but that doesn't affect their behavior. Well, interesting enough that when the dogs started seeing the lab coats more, they had at the same time food that basically drew them together. So since they would see the lab coats half the time, they would already start salivating even before the food was there. So he found out that, you know what, it wasn't because of the food. The thing is, he found out that there was a non-neutral factor in this situation applied with the neutral factor. And when they were both together, he found out that since they've seen it for such a period of time, they become accustomed to it. So the dogs didn't need anymore the food to start salivating. They just said, hey, you know what? We're seeing this already, and we know that this brings food, so all of a sudden, they're going to start getting hungry. So, even though he didn't need the bell anymore, because they automatically, it triggered in their minds, that said, you know what? Every time I see this thing, I see food, so I'm going to start getting hungry and salivating. So, anyways, I wanted to briefly talk about that. That's a theory called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a thing where basically you get accustomed to a certain thing that you see on a daily basis. So for example, dogs, and then you try to add this non-neutral factor and that neutral factor together, and all of a sudden you get, after a while, the person will start feeling certain things. So to me that was really interesting, because in my classroom, when I was talking earlier about my attention getter, you know, I started off with one of those attention getters, class, class. And then all of a sudden, I would transition into a new attention getter. And because my students were already accustomed to the old one, they would already revert and be able to do this one. Also, I just find it interesting because, you know, I've noticed that certain situations that certain students act in a different manner. And to me, when I was reading Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning, it really made me think, I mean, I hope it makes you think as well. Because you go, on a daily basis, there are certain things. For example, when I go and I'm into work and it's around lunchtime, and you know how we all get during lunchtime. We're pretty hungry. But even before I see the food, when I see 12 o'clock and I see the clock, I'm automatically, even before I see food or anything, my natural body process goes, ooh, I'm hungry. It's time for me to eat. And even before I've seen food or I'm about to start eating, I naturally start salivating. So there are mechanisms that start triggering all these effects in us. So to me that was really interesting. And then there was a man named John Watson. John Watson wanted to even expand more into that. He was like, you know what, honestly, you're studying dogs and you're studying mammals, but you know what, I want to see how this works on humans. So he decided that he was going to do an experiment. He did an experiment with Albert, who was an 11-month-old infant child. And when he did the study, he wanted to try to see if Albert would be afraid of a white rat. So basically what he did was he put a noise and the white rat together. In the beginning, it did nothing. But then after a while, because of the white rat and the noise together, that started, again, when we were talking about the neutral factor and the non-neutral, they were together. So that automatically brought back a fear into the child Albert, because when those two things were together, it triggered. So the factor that was non-neutral, that was the noise that was affecting, because he already felt, well, you know what? Every time these two things are close together, he's automatically going to get a reaction. So those two things work hand in hand. So basically, from that, he found out that, you know what, the loud noise can induce the fear of the rat. And from the study, he ended up finding out that actually most things that humans could actually have phobias because of that. Alright, so class. You know, today we were going through Watson and we were going through Pavlov, and they bring many interesting research and findings. But you know what? How can we apply this? Because the truth is, I talked about how at lunch I normally have that mechanism where I start feeling. And for example, let me show you my water bottle. Automatically, have you noticed that every time you see someone grab a bottle of water, as I'm showing the example now, you automatically have this thirst. Or when you yawn and someone sees you yawn, it automatically triggers another yawn. So it's just interesting for me how I see these social behaviors, and certain things bring all these other things. So class, what I want you to do is think about that. Think about how these things work hand in hand. How a factor that has nothing to do with one, when you bring it together with another factor, is able to cause, for example, in the case of Albert, a fear. And then we have the example from Ivan Pavlov, where we see that the dogs are actually salivating even when they're not seeing the food. So to me, that's really interesting. And those are thoughts that I want you to have. I really want you to dig deep and think about those things. Because honestly, every time I go in the classroom, one of the first big things I think about is, well, you know what? How does this correlate to this? Because I have students in certain situations, for example, that are well-behaved kids, but then you place them in a situation where there may be a student who is not paying attention as much as they are. So you put them in that situation and you say, well, that good kid will still be able to behave well. But guess what? We changed a variable. And when we change a variable, sometimes, guess what happens? After a while, that student goes, okay, now I have a change in an environment, and I'm around students that are not being as hardworking and not maybe interested in the subject matter, and you place them both together, and then all of a sudden that student is not concentrating as much because we changed a factor, but we look at it and we go, well, why does the change of place factor into it? But when those two things are together, then we start seeing differences. Because this is a concept we can apply in the classroom. We're all here trying to learn and better things for our students, so we really need to think deep into these concepts. So for me, I really want you to consider that as you do your homework tonight and you research. So my closing thoughts are here, that again, Ivan Pavlov's conditioning statement and theory is one that we really need to think how we apply and we see in the classroom, because sometimes certain variables make a difference and we don't even realize that. So as teachers and educators, we strongly have to think what's going to be the best for our students, and we need to see how that will factor into it. So class, I really hope you do your research tonight, and I will see you next class.